Robert Litvak. I direct international security studies at the Woodrow Wilson Center. I'd like to welcome you to today's meeting, another in our ongoing series on terrorism and homeland security issues that the Center co-sponsors with Georgetown University's Center for Peace and Security Studies. The co-chair of the series is Professor Bruce Hoffman. Before turning the floor over to him to introduce our speaker and to tee up today's issue for discussion, let me just announce a forthcoming meeting on April 6th, same time, noon to 1:30. We're going to have one of the preeminent terrorism experts from Europe, Professor Fernando Renares from Spain, to discuss the Madrid bombings 5 years later. So await the formal notice on that, but just to give you a curtain raiser of future events. With that, let me turn the floor over to Bruce Hoffman and just say it's a real pleasure to have Gina Bennett here with us today, but Bruce will do the honors of introducing her.
Thanks, Rob. Thank you all for coming. It's really a great pleasure to welcome Gina Bennett. I think it's rare that she is able to address these types of forums in public. So it's really a great privilege and pleasure. Gina's the author of a book, National Security Mom, which is available on sale outside. It was featured as the cover story of the February National Interest magazine. It's a fascinating book. I think it's a bit different from most books on terrorism, since it combines Gina's experience raising 5 children and also tending after her husband, as well as her long career in the United States intelligence community. Gina's particularly noteworthy because in 1993 she wrote a memorandum when she was at the Bureau of Intelligence and Research at the State Department, titled "The Wandering Mujahideen," that identified Osama bin Laden as an up-and-coming player in the terrorist movement and predicted or warned that there would be attacks in various unexpected or unforeseen places, exactly as materialized in 2001. She's most recently served as the Senior Deputy National Intelligence Officer for Transnational Threats, where she was the principal author of one of the more important but also controversial national intelligence estimates, the May 2006 estimate titled "Trends in Global Terrorism: Implications for the United States." That was not only important but a very courageous document in identifying a rising threat that has unfortunately materialized. So Gina's someone with enormous knowledge, a 20-year-plus career in the United States intelligence community, now an author of a openly distributed document, which is to say her latest book, and we're delighted to have you.
Thank you. Thank you, both of you. I'm thrilled to be here, but I have to first apologize to anyone here who's not a parent, because some of this humor might escape you at first, but trust me, if you ever become a parent, maybe you'll recall some of this and think, oh yeah, now I get what she was talking about. My book is definitely out of ordinary for a counterterrorism expert, for a counterterrorism or national security policy discussion. So I just want you to understand that I'm approaching this with an awful lot of humor. My mother always told me there was truth in jest, so I hope you can find the truth mixed in with this humor as well and the comparison. I want to start by saying I know that comparing parenting and national security or counterterrorism policymaking isn't obvious at first. It wasn't really obvious to me, even though I was doing it for many years. But a few years ago, I was invited to speak at a mentoring event at the agency, and I think the organizers of the event were looking for someone who had some organizational time management skills. The discussion was about balancing work and family, and they thought, well, this lady has 5 kids and she's a full-time analyst in the Counterterrorism Center. She must have some method for staying sane. But I realized, as I thought about it, in fact, I was just going from one place to the next, just trying to keep up like everyone else. So I really did stop and I thought about it for a little while. And as I did, I was in the process of writing the National Intelligence Estimate on Global Trends in Terrorism. So I was in this strategic frame of mind. And what I realized is, at home, I was trying to provide my children with the coping skills they would need to live their life someday without me, without coming back after going to college and getting married and having their own children. And at work, really, fundamentally, what we're trying to do as counterterrorism specialists in the intelligence community or in any form of national security is we're hoping to enable America to live and cope with whatever threatens us on any given day, and to be able to sustain our way of life. So my book examines this comparison, and it really comes from the heart. It comes from the parenting side. It's a lot easier for me to speak to that. I feel very confident that I have gained that expertise without the aid of the CIA. So that's one of the reasons why I start with that. What I thought I would do, because I do want to leave time for questions, is just give you a flavor of the 3 sections of the book. It's a very short book. I wrote it in very crisp and short chapters, intentionally for those of you who ever sit in the waiting office of a doctor's office or the orthodontist, and sitting in the car waiting for your son to pack up his baseball gear or whatever it is. You have something to read, and you can get through one chapter pretty quickly. But it's divided into 3 sections, and the first part is really looking at the parenting truisms, those things we know as parents just to be true. Actions speak louder than words, including our own actions, especially when our children are watching, and we're hoping they're not. Certainly, life is not a fairy tale is something that we have to pass along. We know that to be true. We know we have to teach our children that someday. The second part of the book looks at the advice we hear ourselves give our kids every day. If you don't have something nice to say, don't say anything at all. I heard that one once. I heard it 1,000 times from my own mom. And looks at how those sorts of statements are, as we give the advice to our kids, are just as applicable for America. And certainly if someday we hope our children are presidents, we would like for them to follow those rules when they're the leaders of this country. The third part was really geared toward motivating everyone to understand what their individual role in national security is. Because so often I think the conversation is about Washington. It's about the intelligence community, the law enforcement community, the military, and what our responsibility is to America for keeping it secure. And I think sometimes we miss the discussion about individual roles in that. So I tried to end the book with, here's what you can do as a mom, as a parent, as just an average citizen. So I thought I would just give you a little sample of each one of those. So I think that this, I can probably guarantee this will be the closest thing the Wilson Center has ever had to home movies. Again, these are all unclassified pictures, so I was able to bring them here. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. We all know this one. Every winter I face the same battle. Those kids would really much rather go out of the house in a t-shirt and a pair of shorts or barely clothed at all, even though it's freezing outside. And I tell them the same thing. Your body can only fight one thing at a time. If it's trying to keep you warm, it's not going to be able to fight all those germs and you're going to get sick. I have no scientific proof for this, but it makes sense. It's just common sense. And so I also tell them, if you get sick, I'm not going to be sympathetic, so don't think you're going to ring your bell and get chicken soup in your bed. And one of the things I know as a parent is you should never make an idle threat. So when my kids get sick, and inevitably they do, I try to not be sympathetic and to, make them kind of feel the pain of being sick. And I hope that someday they're going to listen to what I have told them. Same is true in national security. It's practical and it's prudent to use caution, to do what we can to lower the risks. The law enforcement, the intelligence community, the military, Homeland Security, we're all trying to do what we can to prevent another terrorist attack in the United States. I've been a part of that endeavor for 20 years. As Bruce said, in 1993, I published a series of papers. Some of these have been made unclassified in various Freedom of Information Act requests, so I'm able to share them much more openly. But 16 years ago, this first series of papers warned of some of what we have seen unfold in the last decade. When these papers were declassified, I think in the wake of the 9/11 Commission research, I read them again, and it was really disturbing for me personally to read these over again. I mean, as you can see, and if you can't read it, I'll just read it for you. In 1993, in one of these papers, I was talking about, or actually this one was from 1996, so it was a follow-on. I was talking about bin Laden as he was thinking of moving to Afghanistan. It was being pressured by the U.S. government to leave Sudan, and of course, Sudan was under a lot of scrutiny at the time as a potential state sponsor of terrorism, which it eventually was labeled as. And in the analysis I wrote, keeping bin Laden on the move by reducing his haven options will inconvenience him. But then he has all of these informal networks and associations to draw upon for his support for infrastructure, for keeping the organization that he had already started going. So even a bin Laden on the move can retain the capability to support individuals and groups who have the motive and wherewithal to attack U.S. interests almost worldwide. That's as true, I think, today as it was 13 years ago in 1996. And that's not something I think that we really want to see, but it is, I think, as true then. When I warn my kids that if they go out the door without their jacket on or their hat on a rainy, snowy day, they're going to get sick, obviously I don't really want them to get sick. I would like for my warning to be wrong, and I'd like for them to stay well. I just want them to listen to me. When they do get sick, I can try to play tough and not be unsympathetic, but in my heart of hearts, I really, really want them to be well. I'd give anything today for this analysis to have been proven wrong, anything. But I can't take it away, and it has been proven somewhat right. And what I can tell you is in the intervening years, just like when you tell your children, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this, and they don't get sick, and then they think, well, you're crying wolf. I think that's what happened. For many years, we talked about Al-Qaeda, we talked about bin Laden. It was difficult for people to believe that this type of terrorism, an individual could be as dangerous to the United States as a state. We were very much still in a state sponsorship of terrorism frame of mind. We had just come off the Libya Pan Am 103 bombing, which was the greatest attack against the United States' interests in a long, long time. So I think it was hard for people to accept this change, and it did seem like we were crying wolf. Nonetheless, September 11th changed all of that. The 9/11 Commission report concluded that the analysts in the intelligence community had failed to connect the dots, that we didn't figure out the attack, and we could have, that the dots were there, and it should have been somewhat obvious to us that there was a plot underfoot, and exactly a little bit more about what it was than the famous August 2001 PDB, which I'm sure you've all read. It sounds simple enough, connect the dots. It's one of my kids' favorite things to do. It's pretty straightforward, but it's not connecting dots. And intelligence is not dots. And in fact, prior to 9/11, if you want to think of it that way, we had so many dots, the page was just black. It was hard to see any kind of plot from the multiple plots that were there, all of which, for those of us who had been immersed in this particular group, all of which seemed plausible. So it's very difficult to provide your policymakers with, well, we think this one over that one. And we can discuss this more if you're interested. But I think what's really important to understand is intelligence itself. It's not a fact. I mean, everything I read is as much a lie as it is truth. And it's often and almost always difficult to tell the difference. Even when you look at an intercept of a communication between a terrorist leader and somebody else, it's not a straightforward conversation any more than your conversations with your family or friends are straightforward conversations. You're not exchanging facts. You are having a conversation based on an awful lot of shared history, context, maybe even innuendo. And in the case of terrorists, they're using coded language as well. And I think of this when I watch my teenagers texting each other, the instant message language that barely anyone can really understand. But if you even if you think you can crack that code and you got your little cheat sheet of what all those terms and acronyms mean, you're still not going to be able to pick up what they're saying to each other because you don't know what their history is or what the context is. Believe it or not, intelligence is really not all that different from trying to break into your teenager's same-time messaging. So my point in here in bringing this up is that no matter how much we try, and we will try, we will do everything we can. We, have many, many sleepless nights. I don't think I've slept through the night in, 10 or 12 years. But we really do everything we can. We've applied a lot more resources, and that's great. But I'm not going to put my children in a plastic bubble to make sure that they never get sick. And unless we put America in a plastic bubble, we have to, as Americans, face the fact that we're going to have surprises. There are going to be attacks. There are going to be plots that we're not able to fully see ahead of time and predict. On to the second part. In the second part of my book, I thought about all of those things that I say on a daily basis to my kids, some of which are the things I think, oh, did I just say that? Did I really just say that? Because I always thought, oh, I wish my parents would stop telling me that. But let's assume that our kids grow up and they actually do become leaders. And you're hoping, I hope they remember some of that advice that I gave them. Like this one, clean up your own mess. Don't ask anybody to take my coffee cup into the sink and wash it. Nobody does my laundry for me. I just want my children to clean up their own mess. And yes, I mean that literally, but of course I also mean it metaphorically as well. So to illustrate this point in my book, I looked at the Iraq situation. This was during the time that we had candidates campaigning for during the primaries. What I was hoping to hear was a candidate say, okay, well, timetable, no timetable, blah, 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 blah. But no matter what, we're still going to have a mess. There's still going to be failures. There's still going to be problems. But that's not really the kind of election campaign speak that you typically get. But in thinking about cleaning up our own mess, cleaning up our children cleaning up their messes, I tried to apply that scenario to Iraq. And so what is a cleaned up Iraq going to look like? And we're still debating this. I think we will be debating it for a long time as events unfold and a timetable is put into place and actually carried out. In Iraq, is the success going to be just bringing home the troops? Is it going to be leaving behind a stable government, a thriving democracy? Or is it going to be knowing that as we depart, maybe a situation like what happened in Afghanistan after the Soviets depart will unfold, where you have a fair amount of civil strife for many years and then eventually civil war? Or perhaps some organization that we have yet to even know exists, like the Taliban, eventually take over. Will there still be a safe haven for groups like Al-Qaeda in Iraq or others who will use the insecurity and the instability and the lack of full credibility of a central government in order to plot and plan attacks against us? If we haven't killed them all there, can we cope with the fact that they might still want to attack us here? I think these are questions that we're going to be dealing with for a long time in terms of the cleanup in Iraq. Again, thinking about my children, if I suspend reality for a little while and I actually believe that someday they will follow my advice and actually clean up their own messes, I can tell you my kids are very, very different. I have my daughter, my oldest daughter, who would when it's time for her to clean up her room, she goes in there and she takes everything out of the closet, everything off of her shelves, purges, reorganizes. It's a beautiful thing to see when she is done. It takes a long time, and there are unbelievable piles of stuff all over the house, things that she got rid of, but somebody else is going to have to deal with. And that somebody else is me or her brothers or somebody. Her Iraq would be beautiful. Oh my God, it would be a gorgeous model of democracy, probably even better than the United States. But it would take a long time, maybe 100 years or so. I can't even imagine what the rest of the Middle East would look like in the process, or how little bit of money we would have left in doing it. So yes, it's an extreme, but there you have it. I have a son who's just less than 2 years older than her, so a lot of friction there, who is the opposite, complete opposite. Clean your room. Oh, done in 10 minutes, ready for inspection. Go up there, you open the door. Okay. Looks okay, the bed's in the right place, everything's fine. Don't open the closet. Don't look under the bed. Now, he can find his baseball gear. He can find a couple of T-shirts. That's all he ever needs, the same T-shirt over and over again. And on occasion, he can find some other things like Legos and maybe some of his school books. And that's all he cares about. It's functional. It works. You open the door. It's, site-proof. In case you're taking a friend on a tour of the house, works fine. It's just going to fall apart at any moment. It's going to explode. And that's what his Iraq would look like, too. And there's some people who would appreciate that. We'd be out of there quickly, or we would have been out of there quickly, I should say. It would look fine as soon as we pulled out. It wouldn't have cost very much. wouldn't have cost anybody else any immediate problems because the messes were all still under the bed. But I can guarantee you we would be dealing with it for a long time. We just might not be able to blame him for it. So those are the two different kinds of clean. I think, in illustrating it is in a way that's, funny, I know, is extreme. But I think the point, ultimately, is that there is no clean, and there's always a mess. And at some point over the next few years, we have to talk about and decide what we're going to tolerate in terms of the mess. What's going to be acceptable for us as Americans, and some of that is going to be terrorism and security threat. There's just no question in my mind. So the third part of my book, I think, is probably the most unconventional for a Washingtonian or a counterterrorism expert to be talking about, and it has to do with the individual's role in national security and hope. I took my favorite quote from Gandhi of, "We must be the change we wish to see," and turned it around a little bit. The strength and security of my family isn't really dependent on the lock on the front door, in part because we never seem to lock the front door. My husband's not very good at locking anything, and we've had some things stolen out of the car as proof of that. But I think our security, our strength comes from the good example my husband and I try to set, and the unconditional love we have for each other that we demonstrate consistently. We pass on this kind of security to our children. We teach them the hard lessons of life. We try to prepare them to cope in a very cruel world at times. We help them become independent and responsible, and it does help to teach them how to cook and do the laundry. But our nation's security is not dependent on a lack of terrorist attacks, any more than my family's security is dependent on nobody coming in and stealing our stuff. I mean, we'll survive. The house could burn down. We will still be a safe and secure family. If we're on pins and needles, wondering every day if the government is going to be able to stop the next plot, is that really security? Isn't it, in fact, the definition of insecurity? Always worrying and wondering about what might happen. Our security rests with the endurance of our values, our principles of democracy, and our commitment to them. Our strength is not the projection of power or the absence of challenge. It's the character we demonstrate as a nation when challenged that makes America strong and secure. I think ultimately the real mistake we made in the aftermath of 9/11 was allowing the terrorists to shake our faith in ourselves and each other. And that's a form of influence. We allowed the terrorists to influence us. But I think right now, as Americans, we're holding our country in our arms again and realizing it for its possibilities. Just like when a mom holds her baby in her arms for the first time, she falls in love. I mean, who wouldn't fall in love with a face like that? You know that there are going to be many, many challenges and heartaches along the way, but you always look at your child for the wonderful possibilities that he or she is going to be. And I think right now, despite the economic chaos and the uncertainties, we're hoping for a brighter future on a lot of fronts. It's not typically the sort of thing that a counterterrorism expert would talk about as part of security, hope. But yet, I think we so often see the hard side of security, and we don't talk about the soft side. And I'm hoping, though, as a mother of 5, that we are realizing that these intangibles are just as important. We can change what we know needs to be changed, and we can withstand everything, all the threats that come our way. I think if we, as Americans, we work together. And that, in sum, is the what I've tried to convey in the book in terms of looking at parenting and what it really does teach us intuitively about security and about security policy making on an individual and family and, I hope, national level. So, thank you.
Questions, please identify yourself and your affiliation. David.
David Elstein.
Hang on one second, David. There's a microphone coming your way. Yeah.
David Elstein from Georgetown, and this year at the Wilson Center. And I think those of us who are parents, we immediately started thinking about other kind of metaphors and analogies you could draw. And so I want to ask you a little bit about public diplomacy. I have an almost 3-year-old on whom any attempt at diplomacy seems to inevitably fail. He responds to material incentives, right? Public diplomacy doesn't really seem to affect him very much, and I guess to draw a very simple analogy, there continues to be a lot of debate about just how effective public diplomacy can be as part of this country's grand strategy and approach to sort of undermining the quote-unquote root causes of terrorism and everything else. And I'm just wondering about your sort of reflections on that with your experience and how effective you think that can be.
I should add that I've had a lot of responses, particularly from mothers. They've offered their thoughts, too, on, well, I always tell my children this. I think it could apply. And it's been very interesting to see, particularly moms who have absolutely no background in the government, no interest really in this issue whatsoever, actually become engaged. And I think that is very encouraging. And I've started to think there's a sequel in there. I'm glad you mentioned this, actually, because I do think public diplomacy has a role. I think this pendulum swing to suddenly deciding it was going to solve a whole range of problems was a mistake. But that's typical. We go all in this direction and we go in that direction. In my book, I've actually looked at a little bit of an example similar to what you're talking about. My daughter, when she was 2, my youngest one, used to have a fit every day, roughly around the same time. And she would just beat up her older brother, who was 5. And she's pretty strong, and my poor son was very timid, so she had some impact. I never could figure out what it was. I thought, well, maybe we're getting close to her nap time, and she's just breaking down, and this is the guy that she can launch all of that frustration onto because he was home at the same time. I found out later, no matter how often I put her in the corner, because we use the old-fashioned, you go sit in the corner, the timeout wasn't going to solve the problem. What was happening was, this is a typical toddler. She was running around the house, not really eating her food. When she came back to eat her food, it was gone because her brother was eating it. So it really didn't matter. It's a true story. It really didn't matter how often I sat her in the corner and tried to persuade her, you can't do that, you can't behave that way, blah, 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 blah. It doesn't matter. He was taking her lunch. She was hungry. The root causes. And I think that is so often the undiscussed issue. I imagine it must be extremely frustrating. I mean, almost to the point of perhaps making you feel suicidal, really, to live in a situation where the only person championing your cause is a terrorist group. And because they are, no one is going to listen to what your grievances are, because you're automatically associated with this terrorist organization. And because people will automatically assume you condone what they do because they say they're doing it on your behalf. And I think that's an extreme situation, but that is what can happen if we look at root causes and the discussion of root causes as being apologetic to terrorism or soft on terrorism. And I'm hoping, although I don't think public diplomacy can solve everything, and especially not if you look at it as U.S. propaganda, we're really just trying to force a particular point of view, which is alien to begin with. But I do hope that now that we are looking at public diplomacy much more than we ever were before and the role of counterterrorism, that we can begin to have a little bit more open dialogue and discussion of root causes.
Yes, sir.
Jerry Olek, retired intelligence analyst, grandfather, parent. I like your analysis, and I agree with almost everything you say. I have a question on, it was frustrating for me to see evidence ahead of time developed by me or other people and then not have it responded to or acted upon. And obviously it was frustrating to you to have this evidence and an analysis that was proven to be right but was not acted on. Is there anything that, when you look back on it, that you should have or could have done to make people realize this is more real than you seem to accept? Because I hear the same argument with our economic problems, that journalists were out there and economists were out there talking, hey, this is bad, exuberance and all that stuff. Everybody knew something bad was coming, but nobody could be convinced that we should do something about it.
Well, I think in part we have built a much stronger and dynamic relationship with the academic and think tank community from within the intelligence community. We have far more outreach happening and exchanges between the two. And I'm excited about that potential. And the reason is because a couple of things. As an intelligence analyst, which I'm sure you know, there's a certain amount of writing off what we have to say on the policymaker part, particularly when it runs against what they already want to do or already think, because we're the doom and gloom. You know, we're the naysayers, and we're always the ones giving you the worst case scenario. And that's all true. I mean, we're in the warning business overall. And so it's easy to understand why policymakers might take some of that analysis with a grain of salt. And especially so when that analysis is predicting something so completely outside of what has happened already. And you don't have a lot of data points to support it. I mean, even before 9/11, really the only two attacks that al-Qaeda had been involved in, from most people's perspective anyway, were the Africa Embassy bombings and the Cole bombing. So it's not a lot of data to suddenly jump to major attacks in the United States. But I do think that that relationship will allow partnership so that there will be more scientific method, for lack of a better term, applied to some of the predictions, some of the strategic analysis, and particularly the analysis of trends. Because if we work in partnership and we can rely upon the academic community in particular, those who really know history, the historians, to provide the historical analogies in a very objective and scientific methodological way, so it's not just gut intuitive the way we would do it inside the intelligence community just because of lack of time and space constraints. I think together maybe we can offer analysis that is predictive, and even though it might be outside of the norm, might be taken more seriously when it's coming from more than one source. Is that okay?
Oh, Howard Moreland, grandfather. This may be beyond your area of expertise. I don't know how much time you spent talking about nuclear deterrence, but it is a national security issue. And for years I've tried to explain nuclear deterrence in terms of the parent-child relationship and make an analogy to if you don't do what I say, I'm going to lock you in your room and blow it up. And the child will possibly think you're crazy enough to do it, or figure this is a bluff that I can easily call. But one of the first things you said was never make an idle threat. And seems like that applies to nuclear deterrence as well as to these other things you're talking about.
Nuclear deterrence is outside of my area of expertise, absolutely. And I agree, you should never make an idle threat. And then, of course, there's the problem of as a parent, you've probably had some irrational moments as well. So I think, obviously in your area, you're also depending on all the actors to act rationally at some point. And being able to understand what the actor's rationale is always the tricky part. And I certainly have that problem with my own children. I don't think that it necessarily gets easier as we get older. I mean, sometimes we think we know what our rationale is and we can be predictable, but every once in a while we have our moments.
Let's go to this gentleman.
Paul Wickberg, State Department of Intelligence and Research. While I'm not a parent myself, I have with great interest watched my two brothers raise their kids to the point where they've gotten them out of the house and away to college. And I think they would both agree that the toughest part for them was the mid-teens, because you have kids who don't really understand some of the things that are happening to them. They've got hormones raging through their blood, and sometimes they just don't seem to make sense. And to anybody who reads the comic strip Zits, I strongly recommend that point of view. Mm-hmm. How do you deal with a country that is having the same problem? We don't tend to call it hormones there. We call it ultranationalism or radicalism or Bolivarianism or whatever you want to call it. But as a parent, how would you recommend dealing with a country which is exhibiting irrational behavior?
Mm-hmm. It's interesting, and we're former colleagues, so it's so good to see you. We were just discussing this at work the other day, oddly enough, because I I do believe, like many others, the United States is just the teenager on the world scene. We're dying to take the car out for a spin. We don't want to listen to France or Britain or anybody else tell us, we know better. We've been through this. Listen to us. Just like my teenager, I can say I was a teenager. I went to high school. No. It's not like that, Mom. You didn't. You're not a teenager now. The situation's very different. Doesn't want to hear it. And I agree. America is very much like that teenager. I think, though, I look at my teens, though, and I realize there's a certain amount of truth. Their world is different. The things that are influencing them are different. The stresses, their goals, they're not me. They're obviously not me. The context is different. I also know as a parent, like your brother as well, I'm sure, that I don't want to squash that enthusiasm. I don't want them to be 40 right now. They're 16, and 13. They should be teenagers. And there's something there that you don't want to flesh out, and you want to try to capture and enable in a positive and channel in a positive direction. And so I think that is also true for America. Maybe it's a good thing that we don't become France or Great Britain. And maybe we'll be teenagers for a very long time. I mean, obviously, the hope is that we don't total the car. How many times?
Just once.
Just once. Okay.
That's only the first one. Well, 2 more.
I learn about what I'm going to be facing from Bruce. We hope that we don't that they don't total the car, that we as a country don't total the car, or if we do, that we learn from it and don't do it again. But I think that that's the hard part, is recognizing that we're a little rash, maybe trying to be a little bit more thoughtful before we make our mark on the world, but also not giving up, because we don't want to stop leaving our mark on the world.
Well,
Gina, thanks for an excellent presentation. I think for most Americans, the attitude towards the individual who was the focus of your 1990s memos is not a phrase that one would use in a book of advice for children, because it would be, don't get mad, get even. And as you mentioned in citing your memos from the 96 that even a bin Laden on the move can do a lot. What can you tell us about the status of our efforts to get this guy?
Well, I mean, if you're looking at it over a long period of time, it is rather unusual, the idea of a lot of resources going toward looking for one person in the world. I mean, the threat is not coming from just bin Laden. It certainly wasn't back then any more than it is now. I mean, we're still debating 16, 17, 20 years later whether bin Laden was the most influential member of al-Qaeda to begin with in terms of the ideology. And I think that that's, that will probably always be debated. But I would say that, quite obviously, the resources and the effort underway now are much more significant than they were beforehand. Bin Laden is still, whether you believe he is crucial to every last decision in al-Qaeda or not, he's still the leader of al-Qaeda. Every member of al-Qaeda, every member of an organization that affiliates itself with al-Qaeda sees him as the leader. So he's obviously someone that we do have to find, and we need to understand the way he communicates with the rest of his group, the rest of the network, and the extent to which he's giving them direction. I think it's an appropriate amount in terms of division. It's really difficult, again, because intelligence is intelligence. It's you can interpret it a lot of different ways. And if you have one analyst, you have at least 2 opinions right there. So when you have hundreds or even thousands of analysts across the intelligence community and outside of it trying to determine, is bin Laden more important, or is crushing the rest of the organization, is getting number 2, 3, 4, and 5 in the al-Qaeda list, all debating all the time. So I think in the end, right now, at least I feel, we're in a good place in terms of dividing the labor and understanding the importance of trying to disrupt plotting, trying to identify all the members of the organization and the people who are important to it, as well as trying to find the one man or two or three or four or five. Does that make sense? I mean, I hope that answers your question.
Yes, it does. Yeah.
Over there, against the wall.
Hi, Megan Parker with the Woodrow Wilson Center. As I look around the room, I see a lot of grandfathers and dads, but not many other moms. And I'm guessing that the intelligence community doesn't have a high number of mothers with young children. Do you see this changing anytime soon? And if so, do you think that increasing the proportion of moms in the intelligence community would improve it? And your book could sort of make that argument. And then finally, I have one toddler, and I'm barely awake. So how did you do all this with 5?
Some people just don't need sleep. I guess that's what's happened. And I've also realized that, just as I've gotten my youngest one to consistently sleep through the night, the older one's going to drive. So now I can't sleep through the night anymore, at least not on the weekend. The first part. I've been in the intelligence community 21 years. I've been a terrorism analyst for 20 of those. So I've really only done this one thing all this time, and that's the community that I have been swimming in. And yeah, when I first got there, I was one of the very few, if only, women at the table. And, over the years, that has changed. I've seen more women at the table in counterterrorism than ever before. In fact, I would venture to say that it's almost equal in terms of especially if you look at the whole workforce, not necessarily the senior workforce, but the whole workforce. So there's something about counterterrorism that has appealed across the board in terms of gender and really a lot of different diversity coming to this issue. That's a great thing. When I go overseas and I have exchanges with various other countries and liaison services, rarely very many women. Again, I think it's a generational issue. It's the number of years. But I do ask this question of some of my female colleagues in other services, and I'm fascinated because I think that so many of them experience a similar sense of the softer versus the harder side of intelligence. And one liaison service officer say that every time I raise an issue, the men always say, "Oh, we knew you would say that. We knew you would think that way." And that's frustrating, and maybe it's true. Maybe we do come at it differently, and it is predictable. But so's the male side. Sorry, you're not surprising us, guys. What's wrong with the different? We can have the different. I think it's the combination of the two. It's the diversity that is so much more powerful. So I think over time it will change. I do. Fundamentally, I'm not a feminist. At least not in the sense of the old version of feminism. My mother criticized me when I had my first child because I wanted to quit work, and she spent her whole life trying to get us all raised so she could go back to work. Criticized is probably too strong a word. But at the end of the day, I think I really don't understand why being intuitive, being willing to see the softer side and the other side is necessarily a bad thing. And I do think a lot of women approach the issue a little bit differently. And, maybe this is good to rock the world a little bit.
Stephanie?
Hi, I'm Stephanie Kaplan. I'm with MIT and the Wilson Center. I want to thank you for your talk. And I'm not a mom, and I was a perfect child, so none of this resonates with me. But I can imagine that one of the things that you do as a parent is, as your children make mistakes, you want them to learn from their mistakes. And one of the things that most struck me when I read your 93 memo was how little we've learned from those mistakes, and not that the Soviet-Afghan war was a mistake, but reading your memo, particularly on the eve of the Iraq War, someone might think, "Boy, this is a really bad idea. Look at what happened to us in the past." So, I was wondering if you had any thoughts on how the national security apparatus or the intelligence community in particular learns from its mistakes, not only in the short term, but in the long term when we're talking about decades of knowledge that's accumulated over time?
Oh, that's a good question. I think the intelligence community in particular is at an advantage within the national security apparatus for learning from mistakes. And the military even more so, because they have a much more methodical and dedicated effort to lessons learned in the battlefield. I mean, the DNI has really fostered and resourced lessons learned capabilities across the intelligence community. The agency has had one for years as well. But I mean, we are in knowledge gathering and knowledge management, so we're already established to, if at least treat the lessons learned in an analytic way. Now, I think what makes it difficult for us as a government to learn is the election cycle. I mean, we have people coming and going and coming and going and coming and going, and most of them not necessarily planning for 20 years from now. How many really do plan for 20 years from now? I don't even know that that's possible or in the mindset. So I think that's where the two things maybe come up against each other. The other, though, is when you use a historical analogy in an analytic product, it can be a very powerful thing, because if you use an analogy or you refer to a historical example that your reader can really relate to, then it becomes very influential. You've really hit them. You've really struck the chord. If you do that incorrectly, though, it can be extraordinarily damaging. So it's tricky to do, and we are still looking at the Afghan-Soviet conflict and the lessons that we can draw from it to try to predict the lessons that we can draw from Iraq, and as we withdraw troops and what might happen there. And I think we'll get some of that right. Some of the prediction will be right, and I'm sure some of it will be wrong because the situations have changed. But I also think we're still, in many ways, fighting the first Afghan conflict, and I don't know that we want to draw a lot of lessons from something that we haven't finished yet.
Why don't we take two questions here and then the last question there, and then break so we have time for book signing. Yes, sir.
Wayne Jakewith from the Peace Philanthropy Project. What kind of wisdom can you draw from your child-rearing experiences about how to deal with a country like Iran that's very adept at using surrogates to work its mischief?
Oh, my teenage son has one of those surrogates. That's a good question, and I haven't really thought about it a lot, other than, in the context of kids, you really can't draw quick conclusions, and you have to be around to watch, to really try to observe firsthand. And so that's probably true on the Iran side. And I'm interested in the idea of establishing a dialogue, observing more directly, being a part of the conversation with Iranians to see, because I think it's impossible to predict third, fourth, fifth, sixth hand to interpret the conversation any more than in the situation when I watch my teenage son and his friend, and whose idea was that really?
Down in the front.
My name is
Hello.
Craig.
Got a microphone coming.
My name is Craig Olson. I'm a father. I will be a first-time grandfather in June, and I'm also a retired Foreign Service officer, and my last assignment was the Bureau of Intelligence and Research. You work at DNI now?
No, I'm a CIA employee. I started off in INR. I was there for 10 years.
Yeah, that's why I wanted to mention that. In your 20 years, and especially referring to the reorganization of the intelligence community half a dozen years ago, whenever it was, I'd appreciate your observations. I suppose in a family, the only time you ever reorganize is if you have a divorce or something like that. You haven't, I haven't. So maybe you can't refer to this as from your family situation. But in terms of the reorganization of the intelligence community, have things gotten better, worse, stayed the same?
Actually, I can see the family relevance there, because my kids, when somebody asks me, so what do you have? I have one of everything. I have, one son, one daughter, one teenager, one this, one that, and it's also personality and strengths and weaknesses as well. And when the weekend comes and we have to crash clean the house or do something because we have friends coming in, we divide and conquer. And I play to my kids' different strengths. My 12-year-old, 13-year-old son, who is the one who's you don't want to see his bedroom, that kid is a fantastic cook. He can cook like you would not believe. We just made homemade crepes for us last week. So I can say to him, go cook the meal, and that child can do it. My daughter, the cleaner, and so it goes. Even the youngest one can pitch in. And so what I'm getting at is the diversity of expertise, the division of labor, and somebody stepping back and saying, okay, how do we use the strengths that each of these has more effectively? And it's not necessarily always in collaboration, but it is also just tapping the strengths, the expertise, and the diversity of each, so that the combined effort, even if each individual agency doesn't have full knowledge of what the other agency is doing, that combined effort is more powerful, hopefully brings more impact in the end. I think it has improved. I think for that reason, does everybody agree with that? No, because I think some organizations thought they would have full transparency into everything the agency does, for example. It's just not going to happen. Any more than I'm going to have full transparency into everything Treasury does or anything else. I don't, personally, I guess maybe I'm more trusting, but I'm okay with that. But what I do see is a more powerful tool in the end in the intelligence community in serving the policymaking community, because I think we're tapping our diversity of expertise more effectively. Do you have one more?
Last question.
Yeah.
My name is Larissa Diriklazova. I'm from Russia. I'm a university teacher, and I'm a mom of 20 years old boy who dreams to become a rock star. And currently I'm researching on asymmetric conflicts, which is close to what you are talking about. So I would like you to comment on your analogy about cleaning the mess. So I wonder if, as an intelligent analyst, you can advise not to create mess at first place.
Okay, so on rare occasions, my husband and I will say, whose idea was it to have all these kids? I'm Italian Catholic. Yeah, I mean, the only way not to make the mess, of course, is to not engage at all. My children have great intentions. When my son, who does all the cooking, cooks, it's, the food is fabulous, the kitchen is a wreck. When my daughter cleans her room, the room is fabulous, the rest of the house is a wreck. When my 4-year-old wants to make some beautiful picture for her, sick aunt, it's great, but again, there's, parts of the house are a mess. So, to not engage at all, of course, we wouldn't make any messes at all either. I think, though, obviously what the intelligence community tries to do on the analytics side is provide as much as we can to the best of our ability. Here are the scenarios that you're dealing with, the reality on the grounds. Here are the potential opportunities. Here are the consequences, potentially, of taking action in the hopes of having the positive impact with as few negative consequences as possible. Can't ever guarantee that there aren't going to be negative consequences, of course. In the end, though, it's up to the policymakers to decide which course to take and hopefully to be responsible for having made those decisions when the negative consequences do inevitably come.
Well, thank you very much, Gina. The book is available for purchase at very reasonably priced at $15, and the author is available for inscribing them. It's a marvelous book, and I highly commend it to you. I think, it was a brilliant device. It's a metaphor that gets at some serious points, and in addressing it metaphorically, It allows someone who's not a public figure usually to kind of step up and address some of these issues in a public forum, and we're most grateful for that. Please join me in thanking Gina Bennett for an excellent